Good day, everyone. So this study looks at the determinants of labor productivity in the Eastern Cape. It's one of two studies that is under the theme of the quadruple challenges that are affecting the Eastern Cape. So the quadruple challenges are low economic growth, high unemployment, inequality, and poverty levels. The structure of the presentation is outlined in the slide, so we'll start off with the introduction and background, all the way until I end off with the conclusion and recommendations. Okay, so looking at the figure on your left, which is trends in economic growth, you can see that after the global financial crisis, the Eastern Cape economy was able to recover briefly from 2010, possibly due to the World Cup. But however, since the year 2011 till 2019, we've seen that economic growth has been negative territory. Economic growth, therefore, has failed to recover, I would say, from the financial crisis by that 1 year of 2010. And, this low economic growth has resulted in a stubbornly high unemployment rate. As you can see, the unemployment rate is averaged well above 30% in the Eastern Cape, which is actually even before the global financial crisis. So, unemployment is determined to a large extent by how the economy is growing. So low economic growth often translates to very high unemployment. One of the reasons for the continued high unemployment rate and low economic growth is low levels of productivity. So the focus of the study is on labor productivity, which can be contrasted to capital productivity and also total factor productivity. So labor productivity is closely linked to the socio-economic goals of high unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Hence, the study focuses on labor productivity. Okay, and labor productivity, as you'd say, is linked to the inclusivity of the economy. Okay, so inclusivity of the economy, ensuring that individuals are able to participate in the economy, is one of the goals that are set out in the National Development Plan and also in the Provincial Development Plan. Okay, so labor productivity basically measures the efficiency with which labor is utilized in the production process. Okay, looking at the overview of labor productivity in the Eastern Cape, we see that since the early 90s, there's been a bit of an upward trend in labor productivity. So between the early 90s all the way up until 2011, there was a bit of an upward trend in labor productivity. However, since the year 2011, or we could say from 2011 till 2019, we've seen a declining trend in labor productivity, or you could say it's been stagnant, which of course coincides with the declining trend in economic growth over that period, and also with that stubbornly high unemployment rate during that period, as we saw in the earlier slides. So actually, in growth rate terms, we see is that labor productivity has averaged on negative 0.25% during the period 2011 to 2019. Okay, breaking down total labor productivity into the different sectors, what we see is that secondary sector labor productivity has been the driver of the increase in labor productivity in the Eastern Cape, or you could say has been the major contributor to labor productivity growth. As you can see, there's a bit of an upward trend in labor productivity in the secondary sector. However, as you can see again, since about 2010 to 2019, we've seen the stagnation in secondary sector labor productivity. And if you look at the other sectors, the primary and tertiary sectors, we see that labor productivity has largely been stagnant. It hasn't really changed much since the early 90s. Of course, labor productivity in the tertiary sector being higher than that of the primary sector. Looking at labor productivity from an industry perspective, you see the best performing industries in terms of labor productivity growth since 1994 are manufacturing and construction, which are part of the secondary sector. If you look at agriculture, which is quite important for the Eastern Cape given its rural nature, we see that it has had positive labor productivity growth since 1994. However, for the last 5 years or so, since 2015, labor productivity growth in agriculture has been close to negative 6%. This, of course, is due largely to the droughts that we've experienced in the Eastern Cape since 2015. If you look at the tertiary sector, the best performing industry is community, personal, and social services. Whilst the other industries which are quite important, which contribute significantly to GDP and employment, such as finance and trade, these have recorded negative growth rates in labor productivity since 94. Here, coming to the empirical analysis, literature highlights the following determinants of labor productivity. So it's capital accumulation, which you could also refer to as infrastructure investments. And of course, we have human capital, we have globalization, which can be broken down into foreign direct investments and total trade. So this to globalization is linked to technology. So foreign direct investments and trade often result in spillovers of technology, and also research and development expenditures in R&D, they're also linked to technology. And of course, literature also identifies GDP growth as a determinant of labor productivity. The study utilizes the ARDL technique for regression analysis. The ARDL technique referred to as the autoregressive distributed lag model, and the data for the study runs from 94 to 2019. So this data set was taken from Quantex Easy Data, and it's determined by the availability of data. So the sample selected is determined by the availability of data. The results of the empirical analysis are stated on or are shown on this table. So the table basically shows a summary of the important determinants of labor productivity. So the analysis looked at the determinants of overall or total labor productivity in the Eastern Cape. Then the analysis moved on to determinants of labor productivity from a sectoral point of view. Then we went on to the determinants of labor productivity from an industry point of view. So the selected industries for the analysis were based on the high priority industries outlined in the provincial development plan. So just as a summary of the results, we see that ICT investments seem to be a major determinant of labor productivity for total labor productivity and labor productivity in the primary sector, tertiary sector, and also from an industry perspective for manufacturing and also for wholesale and retail trade. And what we can also see from the results is human capital is quite important, represented by health and or education, important for total labor productivity, primary sector labor productivity, secondary sector labor productivity, and also from an industry perspective, you see human capital is quite important for agriculture and also for the manufacturing sector. Okay? And if you look at the drivers of labor productivity from the past, such as capital stock, you see that it's only a major determinant of labor productivity in construction and also wholesale and retail trade. And another important determinant of labor productivity is R&D expenditures, which are important for the tertiary sector and also for community, personal, and social services. The next two slides show different scenarios or projections. So these are drawn directly from the regression results. So I'm just going to provide a bit of a summary of these. Due to time, I won't be able to go through all of them in detail. So important thing that we can see from these projections here is that the impact of ICT investments is larger for for total labor productivity, and also is also larger for the primary sector compared to the tertiary sector. So investments in ICT seem to have a much smaller effect on the tertiary sector, and this could be due to the lower levels of investments that we've seen in ICT, which I'll talk about at a later stage. And also it could be that the older technology, if I may put it that way, technology such as internet and computers, it may have reached their peak. So as a result, we need to see more investments in the newer technologies such as 3D technologies, and of course also your artificial intelligence. Also, these results also show the same issue in terms of manufacturing. ICT investments seem to have much larger impact on manufacturing labor productivity, but if you compare it with wholesale and retail trade, you see ICT investments have a much smaller impact on labor productivity in wholesale and retail trade. So the implications of the study are as follows. The current trajectory of labor productivity in the Eastern Cape is quite insufficient to contribute to solving the socio-economic issues in the province. And if you compare it with other regions such as East Asia and Pacific, you see that labor productivity growth is very low. In East Asia and Pacific, average labor productivity between 2013 and 2018 is about 6.1%. In East Asia, structural transformation towards services has actually boosted labor productivity, which is in contrast to what we've seen in South Africa and also the Eastern Cape, where the shifting of the economy or the structural transformation towards services has actually curtailed the growth in labor productivity. And for East Asian regions, skills development contributed to a large extent to the growth rate of labor productivity in the services sector. As I say, this is indicative of the premature deindustrialization experienced in the Eastern Cape and South Africa as well. So the recommendations from the study as follows. The restructuring of the economy remains an area of paramount importance. Despite the relative success of the special economic zones in enhancing manufacturing output in the auto sector, manufacturing output in the Eastern Cape as a percentage of total manufacturing in South Africa is just a mere 8%. Contrast that with your Gauteng, for example, which contributes about 40%. And the study also recommends that interventions for boosting labor productivity in the different sectors should be tailor-made to achieve the greatest impact. The reliance on the traditional drivers of economic growth, such as capital, should be minimized to a large extent. The results suggest that there has to be a shift to a knowledge-based economy in South Africa. ICT investments and human capital seem to be the major drivers of labor productivity in the Eastern Cape. So you need to see more investments especially in your latest technologies, such as artificial intelligence and 3D technologies. And policymakers need to create an environment that is conducive for investments in ICT, for example. Looking at 2019 investments in the Eastern Cape, about 5 billion was invested in ICT. However, you contrast that with other regions For example, in Gauteng, over 27 billion was spent in 2019 on ICT. So more investments are required for the Eastern Cape. Thank you very much for listening.